Well, welcome everybody. I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition here at Yale. This is another in our now long series of GLC at lunch. We used to do these all in person before the COVID years, but now because we have such a large audience out there, and it's a great audience today, it'll approach 100 people out there if we're not careful here. We're doing these almost always online because of, again, such a large audience. And this is a very special talk about a very special subject. I want to get right to it. Our guest, a distinguished guest, and we're thrilled to do this, are Silvermoon Mars LaRose and Jason Mancini. Let me quickly introduce them and a little bit about their topic today, the book, the text they are revealing to the world. And then we'll get right at it. Silvermoon Mars LaRose is Narragansett, a Narragansett tribal citizen. She's a graduate of the University of Rhode Island. She's worked in tribal communities for over 20 years, serving in all kinds of areas of health and human services, education, the humanities. She's assistant director of the Tomaquag Museum, and she hopes to foster Indigenous empowerment through education, community building, and the like. And she is Jason's co-researcher and writer on this extraordinary project you're about to hear about. Jason Mancini is one of the finest scholars here in Connecticut, or anywhere for that matter, about Indigenous history, especially in New England, but he has studied and worked with tribes and native groups in southern New England, Alaska, Hawaii, and all the way to New Zealand. I think they call that transnational Indigenous history. He's very much an ally of these communities as well as a scholar of those communities. He's especially a scholar of maritime labor and migration. He's currently a visiting professor of slavery and justice at the Brown Center. That's the Ruth Simmons Center at Brown for the study of slavery and justice. He's an adjunct professor in anthropology at the University of Connecticut, where I believe is where he did his own degree in anthropology. Anthropologist by training. He's also scientist in residence at the Mystic Aquarium. Jason, you have a lot of jobs. And a member of the Everyday Democracy Civic Health Advisory Committee. He's on other projects at UConn. He's the author of an article in Contempt and Oblivion, Censuses, Ethnography, and Hidden Indian Histories in New England. He's got these two forthcoming projects, one of which we're going to hear about today that he's done with Silvermoon LaRose. And without further ado, they are going to tell us about this extraordinary text, an autobiography that, as I understand it, may cover 3 generations, entitled The Narraganset Chief, or The Adventures of a Wanderer. First published or exposed, I believe, in 1832, in the midst of this rising anti-slavery movement in America and across the Atlantic. And this book is very much, as they argue, I think, part of, or should be part of, the large genre of abolitionist literature. A wonderful and exciting topic. Silvermoon and Jason, a warm welcome to you. I will turn it over to you for the next half hour to 40 minutes, and then I can assure you we'll have lots of questions, the audience and from us. So, Jason and Silvermoon, over to you.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here, and I'm so honored to have this time and space with Silvermoon. Really enjoyed the collaborative work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, and you'll hear more from Silvermoon at the end of the talk, and she'll touch on more of how we build the connection and relevance to her tribal community and why this text matters. For now, I'm going to just share my screen and get into the meat of this conversation, and give you a little bit of a setup for how this came about. See if I can find, there we go. Okay, so part of this is really, I just want to give you a broad brush, and I'm going to cover a lot of ground here very quickly. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, but I want to set up for all of you just how complex and this narrative is, and how many rabbit holes there are to go down and get lost in, as I seem to be doing just about every week now. So I'll do a quick overview of past work, an orientation to this new narrative, how I got to it through validating the text, and then some initial insights to the activities and voyages of this individual and the generations in his family that he comes to relate. And then we'll wrap up with some comments on the significance, not the least of which, as David pointed out, is its relationship to the emerging abolitionist movement across the region. So just to, I should probably try to hide that. There we go. Just to orient all of you to some of my past work in my many years of work in collaboration with the Mashantucket Pequot community, in the research department of the Pequot Museum, and collaborative work with many of the other tribes in the region and Indigenous communities around the world. The Indian Mariners Project really sort of began to help me understand the changing relationship between Indigenous communities and the land they had been dispossessed of, and a reorientation towards maritime contexts. So the work I just referenced very quickly here in an essay called Beyond Reservation, and using the words of Mohegan Indian Joseph Johnson, Preserved on the Mighty Waters. So this is really sort of a counterbalance to narratives of disappearance on the land, that we begin to see the emergence of hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous men moving towards the region's ports, onto vessels, and to places around the world. One of the important record groups for that are the United States custom records, which emerge in the late 18th century and through a good part of the 19th century. They record registers of seamen as they're issued seamen's protection certificates. Crew lists become other important sources of data. And all of that begins to allow me, through logbooks, to track the global positioning of Indigenous mariners. And the bottom right image here is a series of whaling voyages that I've been able to plot on the globe using Google Earth, and just the movement, the global movement of Indigenous people. And this is just one pathway. There's so many other avenues to getting around the world on different kinds of vessels for different purposes. So with that, just recognizing that there are large groups of men at sea, how can we begin to really understand their lives and experiences in a more meaningful way, other than just putting them in space and time? So I began looking for various accounts that might help give some texture. The only known narrative of an Indigenous mariner was published in 1839 by Paul Cuffey Jr., who called himself a Pequot Indian, though is clearly of Wampanoag descent. It's a pithy little piece, about just over 20 pages long, that documents his time on over 36 voyages in many places around the world. So it's an initial insight that gives us some understanding of global movement. There are other accounts that I was relying on to help give some of that shape to the lives of Indigenous mariners. And one is Incidents of a Whaling Voyage that was written by Francis Allen Olmsted. The actual, this published version was made in 1841. his actual journal is in the Beinecke Library, and it's probably one of the most beautifully illustrated whaling journals that I've ever come across. I'll try to share some links to where that will be. Images are online that you can all see. Anyway, there were three Native people on this voyage, two Pequots and one Mohegan. And over the 2-year voyage, lots and lots of detail about their lives was recorded, but not by them. So we had sort of an absence of voice, if you will, in how these experiences were being related. So a number of years ago, I had begun to pore over newspaper articles, historic newspaper articles, just looking for search words like Narragansett, like Pequot, Mohegan, just to see what's coming up. And I found this article in the New York Times published in 1931 about a manuscript found on a Kansas farm. Walter Pierce presented this to the Kansas newspapers, and it quickly sort of spread across to the Northeast, relating the story of Charles Lansing and his maritime experiences. And this is a much longer article. I just have a screenshot here, but the suggestion that it was ultimately unpublished. And so one of the interesting things that I found about this was the relationship to piracy. And in all of the work that I'd done with Indigenous mariners, one of the questions that I was always asking is, where is the power lying here? Many scholars had framed Indigenous presence at sea as more debt peonage to pay off various debts they had encumbered on the land and were forced to go to sea. What I started seeing is more agency in different ways that Native people were shaping their own experiences. Piracy is one that really shows that what we know about piracy is that the popular piracy anyway, is that it's really sort of the white English sea captains that get all of the sort of visibility and credit. What we don't hear about is that 50 to 60% of their crews were people of color. So this was particularly interesting to me in pursuing that and talking about it in various presentations that I was giving about 10, 12 years ago, making this connection and sharing the information with broader audiences. And I happened to be presenting at the New London County Historical Society, and a couple of my Mohegan friends, elders in the community, were present and came up to me afterwards and asked me if I had ever heard of a book called The Narraganset Chief. And I hadn't. And I immediately became fascinated. So I went home and searched in Google Books and poured through it. And it turns out that everything that was summarized in the newspaper article about Charles Lansing was in full published form in the Narraganset Chief. So what in fact was suggested not to have been published had actually been published anonymously, without his name, without his full name in any part of the text. And this began ultimately this continued a 20-year journey to sort of discovering what was behind the purpose of this narrative, who Charles Lansing was, and why all of these voyages were recorded and why it matters. So just stepping into a little bit of background around the book facts, and this is one of my current rabbit holes. And I'm happy to get into that within the Q&A. We know the title, we know the author is simply written by himself, no attribution. The advertisement and editor is Isaac Pierce. It was published in New York in 1832 by J.K. Porter. I get a little bit into the other books that he was publishing. It was printed by Evans and Brooks. I get into some of the work that they're publishing around the same time. And ultimately, it was entered according to the Act of Congress in June of 1832. And I point out in our essay that this was right between the establishment of the New England Anti-Slavery Society and the New York Anti-Slavery Society. So it is very relevant in that conversation. And I'll talk about some of the other reasons why it's relevant and in the local press, actually the regional press. through the book, the author refers to himself as Charles, but never a last name. There's not a single date aside from the title page, and there are references to names, individual names, vessel names, and events. So it really had no basis for establishing a timeline, anything like that. All that to say, and aside, the Library of Congress has designated for 190 years, this book is a work of fiction and attributed to Isaac Pierce as the author. This was done largely in the absence of a known author, a named author. So having made that critical connection between the book itself and the newspaper article that was published 100 years later, that makes the key connection between Charles Lansing as the actual author, set me off on this journey. But before we get into that, I just want to touch very quickly on who Isaac Pierce is. He was very active in New York's abolitionist and anti-slavery movement. His writings appear in Freedom's Journal, The Liberator, National Anti-Slavery Society, and The Colored American. He was involved in the region's abolitionist movement in other contexts. He seems to have gone from Delaware to Philadelphia to New York. At some point, Charles Lansing becomes familiar with Isaac Pierce, and I can get into some of the reasons why they're both in New York at the same time. But it does have to do with his last voyage on a naval ship. So he ends up in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And then just to call back your attention to where the manuscript was found, it was Isaac Pierce's grandson who was in possession of the manuscript when reported in 1931. So this had all started me off on a mad search for finding the original manuscript. So I had called every historical society in Kansas to no effect. But what we do know is from the advertisement, what we do know initially about Charles from the advertisement in the beginning of the book. I'll just read very quickly here. The mysterious stranger, for he does not wish at present, for reasons rendered sufficiently obvious in the sequel, to give his name to the public, claims descent from a noted chief of the Narragansett tribe of Indians. Ambition to elevate the character of his nation and to show the white man that an Indian can write a book and his avowed motives for preserving a record of his adventures. Then he gets on to verifying pieces of the narrative and doesn't really get into the detail of that, but that is ultimately the challenge that we've accepted. So why anonymous? I struggled with this initially, but it becomes clear through the 200 or so pages of this text that Charles Lansing was involved in a lot of illegal things. And his criminality and culpability was certainly something that could have landed him in other sorts of trouble. So throughout the text, and without getting into too much detail, he was involved in counterfeiting and horse stealing, piracy, desertion, mutiny, smuggling, manslaughter, and while perhaps not technically illegal, service on a slave ship at the time. And the dates of that are a little off. It's actually closer to 1826, 27 that we're looking at. He was also, as I'm finding out, and I'll make some comments at the very end, likely involved in a spy ring on the Canadian-American border in Quebec. So part of this, as I mentioned, was really, there are no dates in the text. So how do we build a timeline? How do we accomplish this? What I do know is that he relates about 36 events. He serves periods of time on 31 voyages to 20 countries on 5 continents. So it's quite an extraordinary thing to say that out loud. He was everywhere. And I've jokingly said he feels sort of like an Indian Forrest Gump. He's present in the most extraordinary places. You can see here, I'm not going to go through this entire list, but I will just call out the bullets in bold type. noting a conflict between Christophe and Dessalines and Haiti. He references to Indian boys from the Sandwich Islands or Hawaii that were recruited by and he was later recruited by President Fitch, who was the president of Williams College and involved in the early American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions activities. He travels with a peddler, mentions a cattle fair, counterfeit notes, and his Confederacy of Horse Thieves, and son of the famous Stephen Burrows. So this, without dates, set me off on a journey of exploring newspaper articles and other sources for that information. So as you can see, I could tie specific dates to these references. When Dessalines was overthrown and later assassinated, and then the establishment of Henry Christophe. The two Indian boys are a reference to Henry Upakaia and Thomas Hopu, to New Haven. The cattle fair, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions work is being done in the very early days of 1810, 1812. References to a cattle fair, the first of its kind in Berkshire County, Massachusetts in 1811. And of course, Stephen Burrows, who is quite a character and a very prolific counterfeiter and ultimate spy operating on the borderlands of Canada and the US. So these examples help me to, across the book, help me to establish a basic timeline. And some of the sources you'll see here, relying on the National Archives, the British Archives, the US Naval Academy Archives, and so on. Here I'm going to move at a little more of a breaking pace. I want to just start with sort of confirmation of the account. So in the very last paragraph of the entire book, Charles Lansing mentions getting on board the US ship Guerriere under Commodore Thompson. You can see the quote from the book at the top. So I was able to get to the National Archives and identify through a crew list the presence of Charles Lansing, ordinary seaman, in this text. So this was the first sort of triangulation of his life through both the 1931 newspaper, the 1832 book, and a contemporaneous 1829 crew list. I later went to and located the logbook of the Guerriere at the New York Public Library. You can see the account that aligns perfectly with his service on the Guerriere in Rio when he boarded. And then if these logbooks weren't amazing enough, it wraps up with some beautiful watercolors at the end. So we know exactly where, what the ship looked like, where they were going, and providing that kind of detail. So another voyage he shows up on, or references his time on, is the US sloop Ontario. Again, a quote from the book. He did a little service for the Greeks, went to Gibraltar, fell in with the US sloop Ontario. Wilford Chauncey Esquire is the commander. Spent about a year on board. This is the crew list from right below of the Ontario. Interestingly, his name doesn't show up on this. And he doesn't show up on another list, which suggests that he may very well be using an alias, which is very common. And given his history of desertion, mutiny, and so on, he's probably seeing some headwinds there and using a mariner's capable use of aliases to hide himself. In any event, this is a particularly noteworthy account because the time he served also included a visit from Lord Byron, who was very involved in the Greek War for Independence. And you can see from the Naval Archives in the Mid-Atlantic that one of the people on that vessel, who later became an admiral, recorded the actual event with Lord Byron on the Ontario. And I should also mention that the Ontario was with the USS Constitution off the coast of Italy during this time. A third voyage, just to sort of build this sort of presence, is on the HMS frigate Boudica under Commodore James Brisbane. Again, a quote from the book. At Plymouth, the Boudica got underway with a convoy of East Indiamen bound for Madras, Bombay. On the third day after their departure, they sprung a leak. The pumps were going full bore. They had to turn around, ultimately be towed into Spithead. So the logbook of the Boudica is in the British archives, and this is a picture of the logbook that specifically says, on February 14th, 1825, after experiencing light airs and hazy weather, there's a warning from the hulk, and they were towed into Spithead by the Lightning steamboat. It goes on to say, as Charles remarks in his book, that they left again, went to Rio de Janeiro, and to ultimately Madras. So again, there's no possible way that somebody who wasn't on that voyage could have recorded something with that specificity. So again, we're building this sort of archive of proof, evidence of his presence and experience at sea. So now we get into one of the more interesting and fantastical parts of this book. Around 1822, 1823, he's serving on an Argentine privateer. He identifies as the Young Constitution. I've since found out it's a different vessel. And this is during the Spanish-American Wars for Independence. And Colombia, Argentina, Venezuela are all sort of operating privateer fleets based initially out of Baltimore, but then they're not just sort of privateering in the Caribbean, they're going to the Mediterranean and they're attacking Spanish shipping. They get into a tangle with the Spanish fleet. He gets shipwrecked. Those that survive are incarcerated at San Sebastian and Cadiz. There's a picture of the prison in the image below. And during his time in the prison yard, he notes that, quote, a man of very peculiar manners and appearance was in this prison yard. His swarthy complexion, long straight hair, and dark piercing eyes bespoke him a North American Indian. And it turns out, as they spoke, they realized they were father and son. And yes, it is pretty unbelievable. But his father had left when he was a toddler, and they hadn't seen each other in probably 20 years. He had only known about his father from his mother, who basically said he went off to fight for Napoleon in the Battle of Acre, which is present-day Israel. So his father at that point was in prison in Cadiz for fighting on the side of the Constitutionalists in Spain. He later escaped. Talked a little bit about his life, that he was educated in the English style. He referenced his father's death. Again, mentioning that he fought for Napoleon. He was captured and enslaved. He met and fell in love with a Circassian woman. And for those of you not familiar with the Circassians, they are an ethnic group that exists or existed on the edge of the Black Sea in present-day Georgia, Ukraine region. And during their time as enslaved people in Tangiers, Morocco, Charles was born, which presents an interesting way of thinking about his own citizenship and identity. They later returned to New York and are commissioned to go to Congress to claim lands. And those lands really sort of, that reference to going to Congress speaks to the Treaty of Canandaigua, which is established among the Oneida, Tuscarora, and Stockbridge, who were the allies to the fledgling United States during the American Revolution. The other Haudenosaunee tribes fought on behalf of the British. So there was a particular clause in this treaty that Native people from those tribes could claim lands. So I'm I'm looking for, that's one of the rabbit holes that I'm immersed in at this point. I know I'm getting close to my time here, but do want to try to put a bow on some of this for all of you. So during his time in prison, Charles does learn about his ancestry and his Narragansett grandfather, but who is that person? That pushed me off onto sort of a bit of a organized but wild search for who this could be. Is it a Wheelock student? Is it a brother? Is it part of the Brothertown migration? Is this somebody connected to New Stockbridge in New York? There's a clear connection here to Haudenosaunee homelands, especially given the dispossession of the Haudenosaunee at this time. He references a disturbance in the western frontier, which is likely a reference to the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And one thing that's all too common in Indian country is the attack and murder and pillaging of indigenous villages. And he specifically references a US Army captain named Boltworth. So looking for that as well. So this brings us back to Narragansett country and rooting ourselves in Charlestown, Rhode Island, which is the home base of Narragansett, the Narragansett tribe today. So these are the coastal waters and lands, and the red line outlines Narragansett Tribal Reservation now. But getting very quickly to this Narragansett Chief brings us to the sachemship of Thomas Ninigret, or King Tom. This sheet is actually in Ezra Stiles' itineraries at the Beinecke. They were recorded in 1761. Tom Ninigret was a complicated character in Narragansett homelands. I won't get into his timeline of life, but he's best known, perhaps notoriously known, for his sale of tribal lands to pay off his personal debts. So between 1758 and 1769, he sold 54 tracts of land that totaled just under 6,000 acres of tribal land. And this was done often without the knowledge, consent of tribal members. So much to their surprise, they were being removed off of land and away from their houses, their farms, and so on. This created a tremendous problem and factionalism within the community that emerged in what we might call a party system, a sachem party and a tribe party that raged on through a series of petitions to the colony of Rhode Island and to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in the northern colonies in the mid 18th century. At the center of this was a guy named William Sachem. And as Charles references in his book related to him by his father was one of the greatest chiefs of the Narragansett tribe. William Sachem was one of 5 counselors of Tom Ninigret. He was his uncle. And you can see here, there's one particular deed that Thomas Ninigret made, and the only deed made to another tribal member was to William Sachem. So as I mentioned, he's one of 5 counselors. So by process of elimination of the 5, 2 were dead, 2 remained active in tribal affairs in Charlestown. They were charged with settling the just debts of Tom Ninigret's estate, which was substantial. William Sachem was ultimately an obstructionist to a final sale that included Tom Ninigret's personal home, King Tom Farm. So after he appears in 2 land deeds and in a military census, he never shows up again in Rhode Island records. And then, by process of elimination, we were able to eliminate many other men from this potential list. All right, so just to talk a little bit about the significance, in addition to William Ape's Son of the Forest, this would become then the second known Native American autobiography. It is also, because of its timeline and because of the publication history and context, this is deeply involved with the abolitionist movement, not just because of Isaac Pierce, but because of the involvement with Hicksite Quakers and the free enquiry movement that's going on in New York during this time. There's a sort of constellation of activity around challenging the status quo in the early Republic antebellum era. So it's also particularly interesting because of the three generations that are noted here that give us a sense of men's lives, but the absence of women's lives is also important. And that's something that Silvermoon has really brought to this conversation. And I know she'll address a little bit during her piece. And I think also given the breadth of his global presence and experience, we can begin to look at in the first third of the 19th century, the circuitry of empire. All of these wars for independence, the reconfigurations of nationhood becomes really interesting in a way from in a way that's narrated from history below, if you will. It's literally below the deck. I won't spend any time on this, but empires in the black markets are part of our interests and pursuits. I won't get into this either, sorry. I know I'm going over. The current pieces of work involve his time in New Orleans. As New Orleans is transitioning from being a territory to a state, he's involved in on service on a commercial vessel named the Governor Griswold. They're taken over. I don't know if you can see that, but Jean and Pierre Lafitte are sort of the most prominent sort of smugglers and pirates in this region. And they get hijacked by a bunch of river pirates. So his time in New Orleans is quite punctuated by that. In his later service on the General Santander, while he doesn't mention Jean Lafitte, he was the commander of that vessel for 2 years, I believe, which would have had potential overlap with Charles's time. And then finally, back to those borderlands between the US and Canada and the counterfeiting that was going on and the cave, the counterfeiter's cave. I'm in hot pursuit of that. So the War of 1812 on both ends, from the front end in Canada and the back end in New Orleans, is a particularly interesting way of thinking about Charles's narration of this time. And that is where I will wrap up my time and only encourage you to explore the link to the Narragansett Chief that we've published on Main Sheet through Mystic Seaport's new peer-reviewed journal. And a hearty thank you to everybody who's been involved so far. And I will turn it over to Silvermoon.
Thank you, Jason, for sharing again. My first introduction to this research came from a presentation Jason shared at Brown University, and he invited community members to come and hear. And so me and my sister rolled all the way up north to listen in. And it was fascinating. It was fascinating, the idea that this manuscript could be real, could be someone's story. And if it was, what did that mean for our community? And that was the question posed to me. And really, this manuscript connects this narrative to lived history, to our actual history. And it's what we can learn about ourselves from this, because for Indigenous people, when we're talking about these historical events, and this is our family history. This is our lived history, the history of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, going back generations. So we learn more about ourselves. And it's incredible the connections we start to see when we look at this manuscript and all the little tidbits that he drops out about community and culture and connection. we can delve into more information around Indigenous leadership, learning about what that looked like in communities. How do these individuals fit within the structures that we know to exist within our tribe's leadership? It opens up in conversation around that history of the sachem versus the tribes party that led to a lot of land dispossession beyond what was already lost due to colonization and after the King Philip's War. It speaks to the displacement of Indigenous people and the native diaspora, where we find our community members all over the world, globally, in different places, popping up in different parts of history, and to see ourselves at that point of history. That's hugely important for a community, an Indigenous community who's such a small percentage of the population and are often taught in our school systems that we didn't matter, we weren't a part of these things, and it doesn't include us. And then we get manuscripts like this that show that we were physically in those locations when these things are happening. It speaks to identity, and I think that was one of the biggest things that I took away from reading this. His own personal revelation about race, that kind of coming of age experience that as brown children, we have all experienced that, where race stares us in the face for the first time. And I was 5 years old when I had that experience for myself. And he's writing about the same thing 200 years before my time and having that same lived experience of the reckoning of different, being of a different culture, being other than the communities around you. And what does that mean? And where does your place become? And all of the history connected to race. Even when we look at our understanding of identity and how you get to identify, um, this research brings up some really interesting conversations around that, particularly when you look at the news article that Jason shared where they found that manuscript in Kansas, and it talks about Charles Lansing as being the son of a Narragansett Indian chief and a Negro slave, which, if you read his manuscript, he did not have Negro ancestry. There was no connection there. But the understanding of others about what it means to be an enslaved individual meant that you had to be a person of African origin, which we know that that's not the only people who were enslaved globally. His mother was a Circassian woman. She would have been considered white by today's standards. And it's interesting that for our community, this speaks to the stories around identity of how you get to identify, who gets to determine how you can identify. And so I think there's a lot of great conversations that can arise around that area. There's understandings of kinship ties. Who is your family? How do you draw your identity from those kinship ties? And this leads to conversations around the roles of women in Southern New England tribal communities. Um, we grow up learning and having been raised in an understanding of you are what your mother is, and that's how a lot of tribal communities in the Northeast region identified from their mother's family line. We were matrilineal societies, and so the women connected us to community and identity. Women were the gathering places. They were the owners of the home. And so all of your learned experience about who you are came from those women and her families. So this manuscript helps to open up conversations around all of those different things. So I think it's been hugely impactful in digging deeper into these topics, these areas of history, these individuals who are a part of our a long and tumultuous history. And it's just as we continue to delve in deeper, it makes more of those historical connections come out. And so interested to see where more of this research is going to go. I'm going to leave it there so we have time for questions. Um, But that is what we hope to bring, is having Narragansett people have input on this research as it comes out, and how we are digesting what we're reading and where those connections can be made.
Well, can I just give the first wow? I mean, this is, I mean, good God, this is just extraordinary research, Jason. And Silvermoon, these connections you just very briefly discussed about past and present here across 200 years. Who am I? Who are you in relation to this story? Who was he? I mean, my God, what an international maritime citizen he was. Born in Morocco, on all continents at some point. And by the way, this is so similar to that John Jacobs story, because I guess I mentioned that before we got on the air here. We can come back to that. I'll bring that up later, maybe. I want to go to the questions from outside first. I have a couple of my own, and we welcome your questions out there in Zoom land. There are a lot of you out there. Peter Fay wants to know, have you looked into any possible relationship of Lansing to Gideon Amons, who was a whaler seaman and later Narragansett sachem in the mid to late 19th century? That name ring any bells here?
So if you want to take that, I don't know if you recognize the name.
I do recognize Gideon Adams, but I didn't know if you had looked at him as a potential connection to William Sachem. And I don't know of him being a sachem. That's new to me.
Okay.
For the Narragansett community anyway.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with his presence. I haven't made a specific connection. I think that the Amons family, if I'm not mistaken, descends somehow from the Ninigret line, but can't be sure. It's worth exploring a little bit more. But given that Charles Lansing sort of more or less disappears, I have one possible record for him in the 1840s, but his disappearance from the record after this publication doesn't leave us with a lot of evidence of what his life was after the book came out.
Okay, great. I'm going to keep going with the outside. We're getting a lot more of them. Pat Willard wants to know, would it be safe to assume that all the years sailing by Lansing was motivated as an escape from the reach of law enforcement? I mean, you implied that. I mean, but first of all, what a fascinating life, whether it's piracy or smuggling or counterfeit. I mean, this is a world that functioned in part. I mean, the sea is not always a legal place, as you know.
I think that's an important point, you know, and so his mobility was very helpful in keeping him from experiencing imprisonment on some level, though he was in jail in different ways for other reasons and international conflicts and so on. But I will say, just as a point of reference, and what I didn't get into, is that during the 18th and 19th century, there are a lot of runaway advertisements that involve a lot of people of color, including Native people. And oftentimes when those descriptions show up in local newspapers, there's a reference, detailed reference description of the person, but a warning to masters of vessels not to harbor or conceal these people. So it's very clear that, you know, in the arena of escape from service, servitude, slavery, and so on, people are going to ports, they're getting on vessels, and they're going to sea. So there's a clear pathway for that.
And I don't want to think that the only reason he sought employment on these ships was to escape some kind of sense of justice, because for many Native people in this era, these were job opportunities that presented an ability to gain position and wealth, which did not exist for brown folk much at this point in history. And we were a people that had an understanding of the waters. We are coastal native people, so that relationship with the waters, navigating the waters, was a part of our culture and history too. And when we think about nautical societies, those who had a big understanding of voyage on the ocean, for some reason, people forget that tribal communities across the entire eastern coast were also nautical communities. So it made sense to go into areas of employ that were using skills that you had and had been raised in for generations.
He's a professional sailor. I mean, and whaling vessels, as I think you said, were full of black and brown people and people from all over the Pacific. I mean, it was the first major international business, right? Whaling.
When you actually see when you can build an understanding of the careers of these men,
Yeah.
you come to very quickly recognize that their lives are spent more on sea than on land. And when they are on land, there's particular moments of a marriage or a child, shortly after a child being born, signing a petition against the colony or the state. So you get these punctuated moments on the land, and until you sort of intersect those maritime records, you don't have a full picture. But these men sometimes spent 20, 30 or more years on ships.
Well, lest we forget, there's a reason that Melville's Pequod was this international crowd of men from all corners of the globe. Anyway, okay. Robert Geek says, fascinating finding research. Do we know who the Narraganset chief he was descended from?
So that would have been William Sachem.
Okay, yeah, I thought that, yeah, you already pointed that out. Yeah. Gosh, we've got more questions here. Good Lord. Yeah, well, okay. There's a whole bunch of questions from Tim Weiskell, which is frequent. I may digest them a bit, but I wanted to ask you, just to get you to comment a little further. This business that it was for what, 190 years listed as fiction in the LC. Have you managed to get that changed yet, or is it too early?
Yep.
You have. Okay.
So there are.
That's a small triumph. I mean, it actually is.
There are 35. I believe there's about 35 known editions of this book, or 35 known books that were printed.
Okay.
And so I reached out to every repository that has a copy to let them know of this. And so it has since been changed.
That's fantastic. I mean, it may seem like a small point out there, but among scholars, I think that's an incredible achievement, among other things. Meeting his father in that, prison fort in the KD, that's in the narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just,
yeah, it's actually, he relates quite a dialogue back and forth.
Yeah.
Different insights, not the least of which is his own personal history, his father's history and his grandfather's history. And there's a lot more detail that I wasn't able to relate. And it does get into one of the I saw an earlier question about King Philip's War.
Oh, yeah. I was going to go ahead.
He doesn't specifically mention King Philip's War, but he does talk about the sort of the wars that not just the United States Army posed, but the sort of wars of, empire building through land and dispossession.
Yeah.
The land companies that existed in Rhode Island that were at the core of Narragansett dispossession were operating in New York as well. And then that continued out to the Ohio territory and so on. So you can sort of see, these land companies and people operating in this context are getting better and better and more efficient at acquiring land at Indian expense.
Right. But even then,
and consider for a moment that in Haudenosaunee country, in one day, Haudenosaunee were dispossessed of 13 million acres. It's astonishing. It's a third of New York in one day.
Yeah. Oh, God. Yeah. Wow. when just on that meeting the father thing again, that is how he finds out his paternity and maternity, right? He doesn't even know who his parents are. Is that true?
He was raised by his mother in New
He was
York,
raised
so he only knew that.
Right.
So one of the earliest references, so he knew he was an Indian from the time he was, one of the
Yeah.
first accounts he relates in the book,
Yeah.
basically is a reference to his schoolmates treating him poorly because of his skin color. And he didn't understand that. And he relates that. That's one of the things Silvermoon related to because of that different treatment. It was so like a white person would never experience that. And so it becomes quite, and would never relate something like that in a text.
That was
And
one
that
of the
becomes a point of
reasons,
connection.
sorry,
Yeah.
that was one of the reasons that that really made me think this is a true story being written by a person of color about their own lived experience because of the time period that this is being written in. An outside person wouldn't have shared such a story at that period of time. It just wouldn't have been of interest. It wouldn't have been something significant in their lives or experiences. But for us, it is. It's that coming of age moment where race becomes real to you and you see the differences based on it. And he is getting his understanding of who he is as a brown man from a white woman, a mother who was a Circassian woman who has raised him outside of any indigenous or brown experience. And so there would have been a lot of loss to understanding identity and your role that wouldn't have opened up for him until that point of time where he met his father. So I think, you know, that's the most fantastical part of his story, to meet your dad in a prison in Spain. But if it's true, um, all of his understanding of a whole part of who he is going to come from that experience. But also that's the point where all of the historical connections open up to all of the history of Indigenous people throughout our whole region. And makes those connective ties for us when we dig in to see who his identity may have been, and we look at the potential that he is relative to what's his name? William Sachem, who is the uncle of King Tom Ninigret. And then we start to look at those historical conflicts between the Sachem family lines and the community, the Narragansett community. Well, that connected to my own personal history because at that time, the Sachem family were at odds with the community led by Samuel Niles, who was a relative of mine. I was related directly from his brother. And so we start to see families and stories being intertwined through this history as it comes out, his identity. So that's where we start to really be able to piece in all the other elements of history.
Yeah, I mean, that is so important and interesting. And not to mention, at whatever level, let's just take Americans, still are learning about Native American history. This is not a sedentary people who lived in one little place. These are people all over the world, in a maritime Atlantic, a maritime Pacific, Indian Ocean. He goes everywhere. If I heard you right, Jason, he went around both capes, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, he actually he spent a little bit of time after his time in the First Anglo-Burmese War,
Yeah.
which is when he was on the Boudica. He was actually in China on a hospital ship, and on his way back, stopped in South Africa and witnessed an elephant hunt. So it goes on and on.
Wow. There's got to be people out there wanting to ask this, so I'll ask it for them. You need an agent. You two need an agent for a screenwriter for the miniseries eventually. Do the book carefully, get it out. But I'm serious. I mean, God, what a story this is. Whether people are whether it's
It's on
maritime.
our mind for sure.
Okay, good. We can
Yeah.
talk about that. I know some. Well, whatever. We can talk about Uh, anyway, well, Weiskell, Tim Weiskell has many questions here, but he asks here especially about recovering native voices. You know, there's so few of them, it seems, but it's growing. And could both of you, I mean, maybe a little, the text itself, could you talk a little bit about that? What kind of voice does this author have? What kind of a storyteller? The language written in English? Talk about the text a little, if you would. I think that.
Yeah, he's clearly well educated. It's in English. He's quite articulate. At the beginning of every chapter, he has, and actually throughout the narrative, he quotes different different literary genres. He quotes Byron. He quotes the Bible. He quotes Shakespeare, Cowper. I mean, his library, as it were, is quite expansive and very interesting. And I think that's what fascinates the people that I actually found in a newspaper article that was published 2.5 months before the book was published. He sits for 2 interviews, and there's an account of them speaking with him and reporting about the quality of his character and how intellectual he is. But none of that came from, necessarily a formal education. He did spend what might amount to about 6 months at Williams College training to be a missionary through the American Board of Commissioners. But he was kicked out for bad behavior. And I spent time in the Williams College archives looking for student records, and it was so thin, and he didn't graduate. So I don't.
Was he running a smuggling ring out of a dorm or something?
It might have been.
I mean, this guy, wow, but learned in the sense, right? I mean, he must have done a lot of reading while he was there, or went to sea to do reading.
Clearly so. And, from the time we know from his own account that he was a schoolboy at 9 years old. So he had some education with his white peers.
Yeah.
So if you sort of accumulate that.
Yeah.
It's the work at Williams College. It's the books that he had access to on ships.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Tim Weiskell has many questions here, and you can see them in the chat or the Q&A, and we can provide them for you. There's a whole bunch more.
That'd be great.
And there still are other. Lisa Beer wants to know the Narragansett tribal members who told you about the book in the first place. What did they remember about it? Did any of them have a copy?
So it wasn't Narragansett tribal members that brought it to my attention. It was Faith Davison, who was a Mohegan tribal elder, who was, she had an encyclopedic knowledge of information. So she brought it to my attention. And in my conversation with Silvermoon, her family and community were unaware of this book until now.
Yeah. Wow. Well, there must be quite a buzz going on among Native groups right now about this book, no? And you guys are good scholars. You have to take your time with it. I suspect people want it, right? They want do you have a publisher yet?
Not yet, David. Want to get a little bit more done,
Okay.
but thinking about it. I will say, one of the things that we actually put out in the essay.
Yeah.
Given this is such a complicated narrative on global scale, and we'll have global archives involved.
Yeah.
We're hoping that people out there, people on this call, will help us crowdsource information. There's just no possible way in my lifetime. This has taken me 20 years to get to this point. There's sources of information everywhere.
20 years you've known about this text?
I found that newspaper article 20 years ago. I really started digging into this 2 years ago. Most of this work has come about in the last 2 years, 2.5 years.
Okay.
But I've been fascinated by it for 20 years and sort of passively looking. But it really took off.
I'm sorry, as a student and scholar of slave narratives, I am just enthralled with this project. he cannot, in 32 when this comes out, he hasn't read any of the slave narratives yet by Americans. They're not even out yet. Could have read Equiano, I suppose. Maybe William Grimes, although that wasn't widely published. And there must be a kind of sui generis element to it in that sense.
So I will say, and what you will see in the essay that Silvermoon and I published, I think one of the things that was particularly attractive to the abolitionists
Yeah.
was his time on a slave ship. And he recorded an experience that was so horrifying to him because it involved the killing of living slaves being thrown overboard so that they would be, that the people on the slave ship, they were being essentially chased by the HMS Sibel, which was an anti-slavery patrol off the coast of Africa. So they needed to sort of eliminate the reason for their capture. So they drowned, I think, 38 slaves, which is, that visual is captured in the movie Amistad. But importantly, I have, and this is where I could use some help. I have not found another account with that detail. The only other time I found that account is the Zong massacre that took place in 1781. That
Zong has been well documented, but that's about it.
Right. And it's what precipitated the British from ending the slave trade there. And I think the abolitionists here were deploying it for the same purpose.
Boy, this is Native American history as slave trade history, as abolition history, as American history, Atlantic history. It's really, look, we're running out of time, but I'd love to give each of you a last, we still got more questions coming in, good Lord. I think Michelle went ahead and answered at least one of them because she is herself a maritime scholar. Anyway, I'd love to give each of you just another minute or so to say whatever, whether it's the appeal to folks outside to help with this, if you know anything about documents or anything else you want to say. Silvermoon, you want to go first?
Anything else I want to say?
Another hour, I know. We don't have enough
hour.
We may give you another hour.
I think the biggest thing is that I want to point out is the fact that Jason, as a researcher, took the time to reach out to the community for involvement in looking deeper into this, different insights. What could be useful to our community in relation to this? Are there other things of that would be helpful to us? And just the opportunity to share along with him with this research is empowering to myself as an Indigenous person to have this opportunity. And this is what collaboration could look like if you work with people whose communities are impacted by the research that you're doing. How can it broaden your understanding? How can it enhance what you're sharing and what you're researching and what you're looking at? And how can it have direct connection to a community in a way that can be empowering and helpful to them? So I think there's something to be learned just from the collaboration outside of the actual research itself.
And if I may, Silvermoon, if you don't already know about it, don't be surprised if you're not contacted quite soon to perhaps bring this story into our, for the next 4 years, we're running a teacher institute here out of the GLC on Native American and African American and Latino American history in New England. It's part of the aftermath of our Yale and Slavery project. But Dacia Brabham, our education director, if she hasn't, maybe she already has contact.
We have been connected. She's come to visit us, and we're looking forward to that collab.
I had a hunch
so
that
thanks.
already happened. Okay, good. Say no more. That's great. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, I've always appreciated the work in collaboration with Silvermoon. And I do think it's important to model these kind of right relations with tribal communities. As to the invitation, we make the invitation in the essay, and our emails are in the link to the article on Main Sheet. What I'd like to say is I will work on creating a wish list. And I would
We'll help
love
you
it for,
spread it out. We have a network of, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 people.
I think it'd be great. And I think if there are, at least in this region, if there are students that are particularly interested or faculty members that want to connect and think about individual projects that might feed into this,
Yeah.
I would love to talk about what that looks like. This is a huge project. It's a ton of fun, but it's completely overwhelming. And the sooner we sort of create this global network, I'm perfectly happy to share credit with people who contribute. I think crowdsourcing is the way to make sense of this the most. It's an important story, and I think it requires multiple voices and perspectives.
You need a nice grant to hire even another researcher to help you. You had, by the way, a question here from one of my own graduate students, Wolfgang Scholler. I don't know if you saw it. He was asking about what, or maybe you already answered it. It was asking about whether Lansing discussed or referenced King Philip's War, which for him would have been 150 years before this. And I think you already answered that, but I might put you in touch with Wolfgang. He might be, I don't know, he may not be looking for work just yet. I don't know, but we can do that. But we can.
Happy to explore and just, I would only ask for patience because I get overwhelmed with emails. So I will.
Oh, we all are. We all
respond.
are. I wish we could banish email every other day of our lives, but nobody can. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with one of our listeners out there. Rhonda Singer says, mind-boggling and fantastic research. Thank you. I couldn't say it better. This really is an extraordinary find, project, research, collaboration. And we'd love to keep in touch and keep this moving. And I'm quite serious about, I don't know, the John Jacobs story, which has just recently been published. Another sailor across the world writes a slave narrative. There's a phenomenon here that we could pull together in a mini conference, maybe, that would expose your project even more.
I love that.
In the coming year, maybe, sometime. Okay. A Silvermoon, thank you hugely.
Thank you.
Jason, fantastic work. And thank you all for doing this. We will keep in touch. Thank you all for coming today out there, and see you soon.